Welcome. My name is Chelsea Mertz. I'm a member of the Dole Student Advisory Board as well as a student assistant here. I'd like to welcome you all and kind of go over a few quick reminders. We'll do a question and answer series after Dan and Bill are done with the portion of the segment. And just a few quick reminders. Remember to wait for a cordless mic to be brought to you by one of the students here, as well as to remember to ask just a question, no filibustering. Constant reminder. I'd like to remind you to please turn off all cell phones and put them on vibrate mute. We don't want to have to interrupt the program. And last but not least, it is my pleasure to introduce our Associate Director as well as State House Representative, Barbara Ballard.
Thank you, Chelsea, very much. Welcome you this evening to this program. I am Barbara Ballard. I am the Associate Director for Civic Programming and Outreach here at the Dole Institute of Politics. Just want to remind you a little bit, you have your program, just an update on some of our events. And we'll simply say this is part one. Part two will be next Wednesday, so you can enjoy the other part of this program as well. We continue to have our study groups on Tuesdays and Wednesdays from 4 to 5:30, and we wish you would, if you have the time, come out and participate in those as well. We also, if you'll notice, will have a program on children and armed conflict, and that's an unusual program for us, so I hope you will participate as well. And I think you all know by now that November the 4th is our big program. And when we say big, it's because it is Newt Gingrich, and as many of you know that September the 28th we had Donna Shalala here as well. So we try to bring unusual guests, certainly guests that you know. For many of you who will ask the question, why are you not having Newt Gingrich in the Lead Center? I'm answering your question now. It is all booked. That is why it's at the Dole Institute of Politics. Remember, first come, first serve, and it promises to be a wonderful program, and we have many opportunities, Pizza and Politics, for our students on campus, so you will have an opportunity to see him as well. And on November the 15th, as we do every year, we honor our veterans. And on November the 15th, we will again bring in Moonlight Serenade Orchestra, where we'll have an opportunity to listen to World War II era music, as well as dancing. And for those of you who were here last year, you know, from the minute the music starts, they dance until they stop. So if you're a veteran, World War II, family, and your friends, please feel free to come on November the 15th. And the Dole Institute is pleased to offer that. We don't sell tickets or anything. This is for our veterans because we know how much our veterans have given to our country, and this is our way of honoring them. Now I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about our speaker this evening. And Dan Balz is a national political correspondent at the Washington Post, as many of you know. He joined the paper in 1978 and has been involved in the paper's political coverage as a reporter or editor throughout his whole career. In addition to his political reporting, he has served as the Post national editor, covered the White House during the first Bush administration, and has written extensively about Congress. He also has been the paper's Southwest correspondent based in Texas and briefly reported from London during the fall of 1997. Balz is co-author with Haynes Johnson of the New York Times best-selling book, The Battle for America 2008, The Story of an Extraordinary Election, a Narrative History of the 2008 Campaign. He is also co-author with Ronald Bernstein of Atlantic Media of the 1996 book, Storming the Gates, Protest Politics and the Republican Revival, an analysis of the Republican victories in the 1994 elections and the reshaping of the Republican Party. Balz received the American Political Science Association's Kerry McWilliams Award in 1999 for his political coverage and shared the Gerald R. Ford Award for coverage of the presidency in 2003. He is a popular panelist on PBS's Washington Week and has been a frequent guest on PBS NewsHours with Jim Lehrer, NBC's Meet the Press, CBS Meet the Nation, and many other programs, which means you have had many opportunities to hear him. He was born in Freeport, Illinois. He earned a bachelor's and a master's degree in communications from the University of Illinois. He served in the U.S. Army from 1968 until 1971. Before coming to the Post, he was a reporter and editor at National Journal magazine and also worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is married to Nancy Johnson Balz, a public librarian. They live in Bethesda, Maryland, and are the parents of an adult son. I just want to share with you something about his book, and I told him I started reading his book yesterday, and it was actually last night, and I was trying to get through most of it. It was an absolutely fascinating book. I wanted you to just hear the top part on the flap, the jacket. The election of 2008 shattered political barriers, illuminated an undercurrents of race, gender, and class, and ignited an extraordinary battle among some of the most formidable rivals ever to seek the presidency in Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John McCain. It was an election that played out against a backdrop of war, economic collapse, and deep pessimism about the future. You will have the opportunity to hear more and more about that as our director, Bill Lacey, does an interview with Dan Balz. Good evening and thank you.
Dan, welcome back to the Dole Institute. Second time.
Second time.
Hope to get you back later.
Thank you, Bill.
Wanted to point out that Dan's book will be on sale, was on sale. Some of you probably have already picked up copies. We'll be selling more copies after our session tonight, and it's something that you'll definitely want to pick up. Dan, in January of 2006, Senator Barack Obama appeared on Tim Russert's show and said, point blank, I won't be running for president. 10 months later, he was beginning to open the door a little bit to that, and we all know what happened after that. Why did he change his mind and decide to seek the presidency?
Well, I think that the evolution of his interest in the presidency was ongoing literally from the time, I would say, that he gave that speech in Boston in 2004, the keynote speech, which really launched him on the national stage. Once that happened for Barack Obama, it was always, I think, inevitable that he would seek the presidency. And I think everybody, both around him and watching him, assumed that that would be the case. There were very few people, including Barack Obama, who thought it would be in 2008. And so when he went on Russert's program that day, I think he was giving an honest answer, that he had no intention of seeking the presidency in 2008. Ironically, that came around the time that he got a memo from Pete Rouse, who was his Senate Chief of Staff. They were in a pattern of moving him from having been focused mostly on Illinois work and keeping his head down to beginning in 2006 to make the transition to be a more national figure. And this memo was talking about some of the choices ahead. And interestingly, in that memo, Rouse said, in essence, if a perfect storm of events occurs that makes it possible for you to run in 2008, we should be doing the kinds of things now that would prepare you to do that. And it was Rouse's view that this was almost totally unlikely, but nonetheless it was there in their mind. And I think what happened in 2006 were a couple of things. One is he took a trip to Kenya, or he took a trip to Africa. He went to South Africa and went to Kenya, where his father was born. And he came back from that trip with a sense of how the world would look at the United States if someone like Barack Obama, an African American, were president. In a sense, what a dramatic change that would mean. And I think it forced him to think about it. And the second was, as he was going around campaigning for candidates and promoting his new book in the fall of 2006, there was just an outpouring of support for him and encouragement to run. And I think they thought by the end of 2006, as he told us for the book, he was in a very good place, and he felt that this was something that he probably ought to at least test out. He said, I thought the odds of me becoming president were about 25%, which, as he said, is not bad odds for somebody with minimal experience. But nonetheless, he said, I wanted to see whether there was anything real to it. I sort of owed it to everybody to try it out. And by the time they got to the fall of 2006, I think they were moving inevitably to a candidacy.
We are going to focus tonight mostly on the general election and not the primary, but we will give you plenty of opportunities to ask your questions later. But I'm going to breeze a little bit through the primary, but one of the things that I found very interesting, here he is, a first-time candidate for president. There were several critical junctures in the primary campaign when the wheels could have come off. The New Hampshire loss, which was very unexpected, the disclosure of the Reverend Wright videos, and then Senator Obama saying, presumably off the record, but being caught by someone on a cell phone talking about bitter Pennsylvanians clinging to their guns and religion. What did the way that he and the campaign handled those very difficult, critical junctures say about the nature of his candidacy?
Well, you've identified, I think, the three key moments, and I think what you take away from that is, first of all, Obama's sort of sense of calm, resilience, and ability to recognize a mistake and learn from it. The New Hampshire loss, as he later said when we talked about it, was a real gut check for the campaign. And they had come into New Hampshire after that extraordinary victory in Iowa on a wave, and tried to ride that wave through New Hampshire, whereas Hillary Clinton was down, campaigning hard, and was able to pull that campaign out and upset Obama when nobody thought that she was going to win that. Nobody in the Obama campaign thought she would win it. Nobody in the Clinton campaign thought she could win it. Their hope was to simply stay close enough that they could keep the race going. That night, as he talked to people around him, he said a couple of interesting things. One was, it was never meant to be this easy. In other words, to win Iowa and then New Hampshire, there was something too easy about that. That nobody like Barack Obama should get the nomination that quickly or that easily, and therefore they should recognize that, and they should not take the defeat as a terrible setback, but as a lesson to be learned. And he said another thing to the fellow who had run the New Hampshire campaign for him, Matt Rodriguez. It was a paraphrase of something Frederick Douglass had said. It was not quite exactly as Douglass had said it, but as Obama said it to Matt Rodriguez that night, power concedes nothing without a struggle. And he knew that in a campaign against the Clintons, he was up against the most powerful operation in the Democratic Party in modern times, and that was not going to be easy. The Reverend Wright episode, he told us, was the most perilous moment of his candidacy, and said if we had not handled that moment, if I had not handled that moment correctly or properly or effectively, it's likely I would not have become the nominee. He recognized instantly how bad it was. He recognized that it was a breakdown of their campaign, that they had never looked at those videos themselves. They were available down at Reverend Wright's church, and as he said, it was just an oversight on our campaign's part that we had never gone and scrubbed them. They certainly knew that Reverend Wright was a potential problem. They had invited him to give the invocation at his announcement speech in Springfield, Illinois, and then disinvited him when there was a Rolling Stone article in the works that they learned about that had some inflammatory things that Reverend Wright had said, and they disinvited Reverend Wright from that. So they knew that he was a potential problem. But when this burst out, on the day it happened, he had been out campaigning, and he'd come back to Chicago in the afternoon. And the staff had already been meeting and talking about what to do about this, and his young faith advisor had sketched out a statement, and Obama looked at it and said, well, let me rework it, and basically reworked the statement entirely. He was already scheduled at that point to go off and do interviews with the two Chicago papers, mostly about Tony Rezko, the corrupt developer with whom he had had a financial relationship. And he said, I want to go on TV tonight. And his staff said, is that a good idea? We think you ought not to. And he said, look, everybody in the world is seeing Reverend Wright. They need to see me tonight also. And so he went on MSNBC that night. Didn't say a heck of a lot, but he at least went out there and tried to begin to deflect it. But that night he also said, I want to give a speech about race as quickly as we can schedule one. And so they scheduled it for the following Tuesday in Pennsylvania, which was the next upcoming primary. And John Favreau, who was his chief speechwriter, was tasked to write the speech. And Favreau, when he got the directive, said, I need to talk to Senator Obama. This is too personal a speech for me to write without knowing what's in his head. And so on Saturday night, he spoke to Obama. Sunday, he did a draft, sent it to Obama late in the day on Sunday, and Obama spent all of Sunday night and then all of Monday night reworking it. And sent it to Axelrod and some of the other advisors in the middle of the night on the day it was to be given. And Axelrod remembers getting it and said later, he said, it was one of those moments where I felt this was somebody who was ready to be president because of the way he had dealt with it. And if you remember that speech, it was a combination of a kind of a condemnation of Reverend Wright, although not a full break with Reverend Wright, but then an elevation out of that to talk about why race is still divisive in this country, and to talk about it both from the perspective of black Americans and white Americans. And clearly that speech did get him through that crisis moment. The Bittergate episode, as it later came to be called, he basically said that was one of the dumbest things he ever said. I mean, he told this to Matt Bai of the New York Times Magazine, and it was. It was a classic example of what happens to a candidate. He'd been out all weekend campaigning. The last event on a Sunday night was in San Francisco. Most of the senior staff had broken off before they left the previous state they'd been in to go to San Francisco. There was no senior aide around. He's with a very loving audience, I mean, contributors, loyal supporters, so his guard is down. He gets a question. He's been spending a lot of time in Pennsylvania, and he makes this comment. And it was, I guess the best way you could put it, it was insensitive, but it opened him up to criticism that he was an elitist, that he did not understand the values of small-town America, and it was something that was clearly potentially going to be a problem. By coincidence, I had a breakfast scheduled with Axelrod the next morning when that happened, and he was of a mind. He said, I don't think this is Reverend Wright. I don't think this is as bad as Reverend Wright. And he said, my knowledge of these is you have to give them a little time before you see how they're really going to play out. He was apologetic for it. He tried to clean it up, and I think did, for the most part, clean that up fairly effectively.
As you mentioned, he defeated for the nomination a very formidable Senator Hillary Clinton. What would you say, in looking back in retrospect, were the 2 or 3 key factors that led to his nomination?
Well, I think the first and most important is that I think he just fit the times better than she did, both in a nomination context and in a general election context, which we can talk about. This was an election about change, and he represented change in a more effective way, I think, both symbolically and practically, than Senator Clinton. She obviously had other assets that he didn't have, particularly a lot of experience and a perception that she was a strong person, which he had to kind of earn through the course of the campaign. So I think that was one element. I think also related to that was the issue of the war within the Democratic Party. She was on the wrong side of that issue, having voted for the resolution in 2002. He had given a speech at about that same time against the war, which, if you go back and read the speech, was quite prescient about what might happen if we went in there unprepared for what could happen in the aftermath of an invasion. And so both in kind of fitting the times and being on the right side of where a lot of the Democratic activists were, he had an advantage going in. I think secondly, I would say at the most important moments, he performed better than she did. There were a lot of periods, particularly in the early stage of the campaign, where she was a much better candidate than he was, and he will admit that. I mean, there's a couple of episodes that we recount in the book where they're at a joint forum together, and he does a pretty dismal job, and she does a very effective job, and he realizes that, and he realizes he's going to have to get better. He did get better, and when it counted, he was at the top of his game, and I don't think she was. I would say the third thing was that strategically, his team made strategic decisions that outmaneuvered the Clintons in a whole series of ways. I won't go into a lot of detail, but the one I would highlight is they understood earlier than the Clinton campaign that this nomination battle, in fact, could become a battle for delegates, which is really unheard of in modern presidential nomination battles. It's usually, somebody gets on a winning streak and they win a few events and everybody else falls by the wayside. Their feeling was that if we came out of the first 4 contests, essentially having split them, which is in fact what happened, that then they were in potentially a very long kind of trench warfare, and that every delegate mattered. And they understood the rules for the delegates, and they particularly understood the importance of organizing the caucus states, which are small states, very low participation, often not a lot of delegates at stake, but they paid a huge dividend for Obama. At the end of February, when you had gone through from Iowa to Wisconsin, 80% of the delegates that were then accounted for had come from primary states where Obama had a tiny lead. The caucus states accounted for 20% of the overall delegates, but 80% of Obama's margin ahead of Hillary Clinton came from that 20%. The Clintons loathed the caucuses. They came out of Iowa thinking that the caucus process was a bad process, and they did not compete. But the campaign had not prepared them to compete in any way. And so I think in those ways, they outmaneuvered the Clintons.
And I want to come back to this strategic vision in the general election after one question, but I want to switch to the other side now. In July of 2007, the expected nominee, the strong frontrunner at the beginning on the Republican side, John McCain, was dead in the water and written off by everybody in Washington, D.C. And yet, a year later, he was a Republican nominee. Briefly, kind of, I know there's lots of stuff there. We're going to skim over this quickly, but what happened there?
It's a great story, Bill, and, I mean,
Well, now, some of us might have a different point of view.
Well, it's still a great story. I mean, the wonderful thing about doing this book, Haynes and I have said this as we've been out talking about the book, you finish a project like this, and it's common for authors to talk about how agonizing it is to write a book, and how lonely it is, and you complain to make people feel sympathy that you've gone through this difficult process. This was great fun to write this book. I mean, it was a great campaign. It was an interesting campaign. The raw material was sensational. To be able to put this together, and there's so many stories within the big story, and one of these is the McCain story. I mean, it's overshadowed obviously by the Clinton-Obama nomination fight, but it's in many ways as remarkable. 2 things. One is at that low period, July, August of 2007, McCain asked Charlie Black, who was one of the longtime Republican strategists in the party, who was working as a volunteer for McCain, really the senior person in terms of experience in the campaign. McCain knew that Charlie would give him an honest assessment. He said, "Is there any way I can win this nomination?" Charlie went off, thought about it, came back, said, "Yes, you can, and I've got a strategy for you to do it." And McCain said, "Well, what is it?" He said, "Be the last man standing." Now, that sounds incredibly simple, and in many ways it was, but they understood that if they could simply survive through the fall, keep him out of the public view for a while, and then kind of begin to reestablish him as a credible candidate in the fall, concentrate everything on New Hampshire, and hope that everything else fell into place, that he could become the nominee. So they understood that. The second is they decided, against all conventional wisdom, to double down on the Iraq War. The Iraq War was, in many ways, John McCain had become a prisoner of war again to the Iraq War, symbolic prisoner of war compared to what he had gone through in Vietnam. But he had been an advocate for the surge. It had appeared to have been a bad gamble, but they decided in that same period, we're going to embrace the surge, and we're going to run on that. And that turned out to be an effective strategy. The third thing I would say, which we write in the book, is he was blessed by his opponents. Every one of his opponents had an ability, or certainly an opportunity, to take McCain down. And each had their moment. Mitt Romney had his moment. Mike Huckabee had his moment. Fred Thompson might have had his moment. Certainly had a lot going into that, as Bill well knows. Rudy Giuliani had his moment. But when the time came for them to really step up, none was able to do it. They all faltered for different reasons. And interestingly made, unconsciously, a set of strategic choices that opened the path for McCain in New Hampshire, particularly the Giuliani-Romney dynamic. So that by the time you got to New Hampshire, Romney was wounded because he had lost in Iowa. Huckabee had really no place to go after winning Iowa. Thompson had never gotten traction. And Giuliani was playing what turned out to be a fatally flawed strategy of trying to wait until Florida and Super Tuesday. And so things opened up for McCain. He was able to win New Hampshire and then go on to win South Carolina, which of course had been the terrible experience he had had there in 2000. And I think once those two events happened, it was all the way.
You spoke a few minutes ago about the strategic vision that the Obama campaign had. In laying out the general campaign strategy, I mean, in looking at it at the time and then reading the way that you and Haynes have kind of explained this, David Plouffe, who is his campaign manager, really had three main components to his strategy, or three principal components to his strategy. He kind of wanted to frame the stakes of the election so that everybody would see what they were voting about. He secondly wanted to fill in the details on his candidate, Senator Obama, to millions of Americans who had not been paying that much attention during the Democratic nomination process, and especially independents. But the third part of it that was just sheer genius was he also wanted to take what had become kind of the Democratic electoral map and expand that map. Talk a little bit about those three decisions they made.
Well, the first is obviously very crucial in any election, which is to try to frame the campaign in ways that are most favorable to you. And one of the things, there were a couple of things they did. I mean, they did a lot of research right at the end of the nomination fight with Senator Clinton until early July. And out of that research, they came to a couple of conclusions. One was that McCain's reputation as a reformer was, in their estimation, vastly overstated, that was not the asset that the McCain campaign thought. So they felt they did not have to worry about that. More importantly, that they wanted to do everything possible to focus the general election on the economy. And this was obviously before the collapse in September and October of 2007. But everything their research told them was that if this campaign could be kept focused on the economy, this was the ideal battleground for them. And as a subtext to that, everything they could do every day to tie John McCain to George W. Bush would enhance Obama's chances of winning. And so that was the sort of strategic frame. On the second one, it was so interesting. Haynes went to a focus group conducted by Peter Hart. Peter did about 10 or a dozen focus groups through the course of the campaign, and Haynes or I attended, I think, all but a couple of them. And he did one with independent voters in Virginia in June of 2007. And these were people, some had voted for Bush, some had voted for Kerry. They were undecided at that point. They had not followed the primaries as closely as other people had done. And that set of focus groups told us that for all we thought people knew about Obama, there was much that people didn't know, and there were still real questions about him. One was just simply the question of who is he? Where did he come from? I mean, this question, Anita Dunn puts it, I think, quite elegantly, his otherness. I mean, that in some way or another, Barack Obama was different than you and me. And that came out very clearly in that focus group, and the Obama campaign was learning. I mean, they knew this. They were doing focus groups constantly, and they knew this was to be the case. And so part of the issue was, how do we get people comfortable with who Barack Obama is? How do we tell his story in a way that ties it to the American story, as opposed to making people think that he's Muslim, which he isn't, or that he, had a kind of exotic background. And they decided that the great strength of the Obama family would be appealing to voters of all types. That this was a very strong marriage, that people could see that when the Barack Obama and Michelle Obama were together, that the kids were both attractive and well-grounded. This seemed to be a good family unit, and they looked for ways to put them into situations where people could see them as a family to try to resolve that. He gave a speech, I believe it was at the Truman Center in Independence, about patriotism, to talk about his Kansas roots, to talk about his family, to equate him with much of the way of the values of Middle America. So that was one piece of it. The second was that the second question he had to answer was, is he tough enough to be president? Is he strong enough to be commander-in-chief? And their feeling all along was that they would never be seen as strong as John McCain. I mean, that in any measurement of any sort of undecided voter, people are going to look at John McCain and say, this guy's ready to be commander-in-chief in a way that Barack Obama may not be. But they felt they needed to reassure people that he was ready enough. Not that he was more ready than John McCain, but ready enough. And they felt that the campaign itself provided that opportunity, both in the way he would handle himself at difficult moments, and particularly the debates. And it's one of the reasons they wanted the first debate to be about foreign policy. I mean, everybody assumed they would want the first debate to be about economic policy. Instead, they said, no, we'd like it to be on foreign policy. They wanted to go right at McCain's strength and demonstrate in the debate where they figured you would get the highest viewership, that they could stand on the same stage, toe-to-toe, be as comfortable, be as knowledgeable, and be as reassuring as John McCain. And I think that first debate, they were able to do that. The Electoral College strategy, I think, is one of the really smart things that the campaign did. And I give David Plouffe a lot of credit. Plouffe is much less well known. He's known to the Dole Institute because he was out here for the post-election conference. But David, of the two most senior advisors, Axelrod and Plouffe, Axelrod is the person people saw much more of. He was the communication side, the message side. But Plouffe was every bit as important, and in some ways more important than Axelrod in shaping the campaign. Their view was that they did not want to get to late October and be in the same situation that both John Kerry was in 2004 and Al Gore was in 2000, which was you have to win either Ohio or Florida in order to win the presidency. As Steve Hildebrand said in that summer, we're quite happy to win both of those states. We're going to compete in both of those states, but we don't want that to be the only route to the presidency. So Plouffe's idea was, let's expand the map. We want to open up as many different possibilities to get to 270 votes as we can. We don't want one path. So they came up with the idea that there would be the one-state strategy or the two-state strategy or the three-state strategy. The one-state strategy being, if you win Ohio or you win Florida, they assumed they would win all of the Kerry states and that they would win Iowa, where they had done so well in the caucuses, and they were pretty confident, even at that stage, they could win New Mexico. So that would have left them basically 7 votes short of 270, or 6 votes short. If you win Ohio or Florida, you win. But if you win neither of those, but you win Colorado, Iowa, and New Mexico, then you're over the top. Or if you win Colorado and Virginia, or if you win North Carolina and Nevada, there are any series of permutations that they could do. And so they made some, again, surprising targeting decisions. It's typical in a campaign that you target all of the swing states, and you put a lot of resources into those states. But what their conclusion was, if we're going to compete in a state, we're going to compete all out. And to do that, we're going to have not only a huge advertising budget, but a huge organizing budget as well. Very, very costly. And when they did the numbers crunching, they realized that even a campaign that was raising throughout the course of it $700 million, they didn't have enough money to compete in all of the states where they wanted to compete at the level they wanted to compete. And so one of the things they did was they said, all right, there are 3 or 4 or 5 states that are marginally blue but have been competitive in the past elections, Oregon being one, or Minnesota being another, where the Republicans had made a real run in 2004. They said, we're going to take our chances. We're going to assume we're going to win those states. We are not going to put resources into those states so we can put them into North Carolina, even places like Montana, obviously Florida, Virginia, Colorado, Indiana. David Plouffe described Indiana as my dog. He said, he called it my dog. He said, everybody likes to kick it, but it's still around, isn't it? And he would ask people during the campaign, how's my dog doing? And on the day of the election, he said to, I guess it was Jim Messina, how's my dog doing? And in fact, they won Indiana. But it was, they got down to, I remember that last few days of the campaign, every state that McCain was going to, with one exception, was a state that Bush had won in 2004 that McCain was trying to hold. And the states where Obama was going, he started in Florida on the last day, which this was the Monday before the election, and then he went to North Carolina, and then he went to Virginia. I mean, it just, the symbolism of those final itineraries told you everything about how effective that strategy had been.
One of the things that is really remarkable about Dan's book is the level of access that you guys had. And you can't get into that kind of stuff in much detail in a program that's 45 minutes long in terms of our Q&A here. But there was one episode that I found really fascinating. We're in Denver, fourth day of the Democratic National Convention. The Democratic nominee's speech has been finally written, and he and John Favreau, as chief speechwriter, and David Axelrod are in a hotel room a few hours before he's supposed to do this speech. That's the most important of his career up to that point.
Right.
And he's just now rehearsing it. And it's a very tense atmosphere. Tell the story from there.
This is sort of classic Obama speechwriting, as you could tell from the episode with the Reverend Wright speech. They tended to get big speeches done late. The announcement speech in early '07 didn't arrive until 2 in the morning of the day before, the day and a half before it was to be given. They had worked on the acceptance speech for a long time, but nobody had been particularly happy with it, and it went through a lot of drafts. And Obama worked on it, and Favreau worked on it, and Axelrod helped out on it. And it literally wasn't until the day he was to give it that they got what they felt was a satisfactory draft. And so, as Bill said, it's late afternoon in Denver. It's the first time they're going to go through it. And they've got a teleprompter set up in the room, and it's Favreau and Obama and Axelrod there together. He starts to give the speech. First thing that happens, there's a knock on the door. Obama stops, goes to the door, opens it. It's room service. Obama looks around, he said, did somebody order a Caesar salad? And Axelrod suddenly realizes he had ordered the Caesar. He said, it was me, sir. I'm sorry. So Axelrod gets his salad, puts it aside. They go back and start to do the speech. And Obama is going through it fine. And if you recall, that speech was given on the anniversary of Martin Luther King's speech at the Lincoln Memorial in 1963. And toward the end of the speech, there is a reference to King and to the civil rights movement and to the legacy of it. And Obama gets to that point in the speech, and he suddenly stops, and he chokes up. Now, you know Barack Obama, you've all watched him. This is Mr. Cool. He rarely shows emotion. And Favreau and Axelrod were stunned by this, and he started, tears came to his eyes, he choked up, and he said, basically said, this, something like, this is tough, and he stopped, and then he excused himself, and he went into the bathroom and just separated himself for a few minutes, obviously washed his eyes out, gathered himself back together, and came back out, and then went through and finished the speech. But it was, I had asked him in a couple of different interviews about the sense of history as he was making it. On announcement day, what is it like knowing you are giving a speech in the shadow of the building where Lincoln gave the House Divided speech, and that you are an African American who has, a serious prospect of becoming the nominee or the president. The night I asked him, the night you won the nomination, June 3rd, you go to Minneapolis, St. Paul, you give a speech. I said, I've been to your headquarters. There was a pillar in the headquarters in the press area with front page facsimiles of newspapers from around the country from that day. Almost every headline uses the word history to talk about Obama being the Democratic nominee. And I said to him, what were you thinking that night? You must have had a sense of what history was like. And he said, I'll be honest with you, in those moments I don't think about it. He said, in fact, that night what I said to Axelrod was, we have just won this nomination. We defeated a very strong candidate who would be a very strong general election candidate. We cannot lose the general election. We've got to make sure we win the general election. He said, that's what I was thinking about. He obviously didn't like to talk about race unless, as in the Reverend Wright episode, he had to. So for this to happen, I mean, you could then begin to see somebody who had run as a post-racial candidate, someone who had not tried to make this campaign based in race, and yet how much he felt he owed to the legacy of King and the civil rights movement and the other leaders who had gone before him, and how at that moment it just took over and kind of brought him to his knees.
So he goes out and he does this very, very strong speech, very strong performance, strong speech. The next day is Friday, and they anticipate, as virtually always happens, they're going to get a big bounce out of the convention and put themselves in an even stronger position. Senator McCain had a surprise announcement that day. Governor Sarah Palin. And it, in fact, did freeze the Obama campaign for a while. But how was that decision made? And what's your assessment in retrospect of how it panned out?
The decision on Sarah Palin obviously is, I mean, somebody asked me earlier what was the most surprising thing of the campaign, and I said the single most surprising thing was the selection of Sarah Palin. That morning, everybody's leaving Denver to go to, reporters are all going to St. Paul for the Republican convention, and this is breaking as everybody's heading to the airport. Obama and Joe Biden are on the airplane, their charter, and somebody comes up and says, McCain has selected Sarah Palin as his vice president. And Joe Biden says, who's Sarah Palin? and Obama said, I wonder why he did that. And Joe Lieberman, who had been in the running to be vice president, gets a call from McCain that morning before it's public, and is told, Joe, I just want you to know I've selected Sarah Palin. And Joe Lieberman said, gee, says this to McCain, gee, I don't know much about her. So everybody was stunned. There are several reasons, I think, why he did it. The first and overriding reason is that their feeling was, as you suggest, that Obama was on a trajectory to put this campaign away before Labor Day. That they had to do something or they were going to lose. As Steve Schmidt, the senior advisor, said to somebody in the campaign, we can run a perfect campaign, but we're still going to lose unless we can find some way to change the dynamic of this campaign. And they looked around, and through the course of the summer, one of the things they realized was that they were underperforming with women voters, that certainly they expected that Obama would win more women voters than McCain would, but they were doing very badly. So they were then drawn to the idea of a woman, and it was at that point that Sarah Palin became a serious candidate as opposed to somebody simply on a list, but not a real contender. The more they looked at her, the more they were convinced, A, that the surprise of the selection would shake up the race and give the campaign a different look. two, and I think this was strategically flawed, that they could attract more women, and in particular some of the women who had supported Hillary Clinton who were not yet entirely on board with Obama. I think that was never likely to be. The third, and I think it's very important, is that they knew she was inexperienced, but what they knew about her and what McCain was particularly attracted to was her profile as a reformer. And she had run against an incumbent governor in the primary in 2006 and beaten him. And she had run to shake up the status quo in Anchorage. She had tangled with some of the same Alaska, old bulls that John McCain had tangled with, like Ted Stevens. McCain felt that she was a soulmate in that way, and that if he picked her, they could, in his mind, credibly go say, everybody talks about change, but this is a ticket that is prepared to, if you will, break some crockery, to change the way Washington works. And so he felt that that would do it. There's a wonderful moment that takes place just before McCain meets with Sarah Palin in Arizona to offer her the job. It's both the interview and the job offer all in one. And only if she had performed badly would she not get the offer. As she's making her way up to meet McCain at his cabin in Sedona, he's on the phone with A.B. Culverhouse, who was the lawyer who was in charge of the vice presidential selection process for McCain. And Culverhouse had done a long, lengthy telephone interview, the final vetting interview with Palin the night before, and he's giving McCain a readout of the session. And it is basically favorable. Culverhouse's view is that nobody, with rare exception, who gets picked for vice president is really ready to be vice president or president on day one. That you have to earn your way into it, grow into it. But that she had the capacity to do that in his estimation. And he said he had asked her a number of sort of what-if questions, and he thought that she had handled them as well as the other contenders, and in some cases better. And so McCain says, A.B., what's your bottom line? And Culverhouse said, John, high risk, high reward. And McCain says, A.B., you shouldn't have told me that. I've been taking risks all my life. And with that, Sarah Palin arrives. He gives her the offer. She accepts. And as you say, for 2 weeks it worked, it worked brilliantly. I mean, she energized the Republican base in a way that John McCain had not been able to. Crowds turned out, money poured in, volunteers showed up at offices all over the country, and the polls began to move. And in fact, the McCain operation, for the first time, I think, in the campaign, really got the Democrats flummoxed. There was this period, 8 or 10 days, 12 days after that selection, where all that the Obama campaign was hearing from its Democratic allies was, what's wrong? What's going wrong with the campaign? What are you going to do about this? And, their view was, publicly, we're not that worried. We know what to do. We can take care of this. But privately, they assembled a meeting 2 weekends after her selection in which Obama basically said, look, we're not up to where we need to be. We've got to get back on our game. Everybody needs to step it up, including me, or we're going to be in trouble. And it was literally the day after that Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and the whole election snapped back in a more Democratic fold.
Which is a wonderful setup for my next question, thank you. But was that financial crash required for Obama to close the sale? He had not closed the sale up to that point.
He had not. I don't think it was required. It certainly made it much, much easier. In large part, I think, because of McCain's very wobbly performance in that 10 or 12-day period. I mean, if you talk to I think both the McCain people and the Obama people share a similar view that the campaign really was decided from, I would say, September 15th to, I can't remember the date off the top of my head, I think the 26th when the first debate was down in Oxford, Mississippi. But I think that inevitably the campaign would have moved back toward Obama even without the economic collapse. I think that the combination of President Bush's unpopularity. I mean, to be the Republican nominee and have the incumbent president below 30% in approval rating is a dead weight around your neck as you try to campaign. So they had that. Even before the economic collapse, 80% of the country thought, 80% of the public thought the country was just heading in the wrong direction. Consumer confidence was already way down even before the collapse. Those are fundamentals in an election, and structurally it was just tilted toward the Democrats. So my guess is that as they had gone down the stretch, it would have moved back toward Obama. It probably would have been a closer election, but I think he probably still would have won. But there's no question that when the economic collapse happened, it robbed McCain of any opportunity to even to keep it that close.
I have one final question, then we're going to open it up to your questions, so be formulating those questions, and I'll ask you to raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you when we start that. But my final question is this, you've been covering presidential races a while. I've been involved in a number of them, probably more than either of us would care to admit. What amazed me about the Obama campaign was the precision that it was run with, the measured approach that they took to problems and challenges that they faced, the fact that Pluff and Hildebrands and others that I had the opportunity to meet and talk to were extraordinarily businesslike and purposeful. It's really what we as Republicans like to think our presidential campaigns are all about. It was more Republican in that respect than ours. Right. Was this the best presidential campaign ever run?
In some ways, I would say yes. I think that there is a tendency. History is always written by the winners, and so we attribute to a winning campaign perhaps a greater skill and greater efficiency than we should, and blame losing campaigns for being more inept than perhaps they were. I think that the Bush campaign in 2004 was a very, very effective campaign. For George W. Bush to have won in 2004, given the conditions in the country at that point, was pretty remarkable. So you have to say they ran a good campaign. I think in some ways, though, the Obama campaign was better, and partly because, as you suggest, it is unlike what we have come to expect from Democratic campaigns. I mean, the better campaigns have generally been run by Republican candidates. And there were several things that I would cite that I think are very important that will be studied for a long time about the Obama campaign. One was simply the culture of the campaign. And I think the culture of every campaign flows directly from the candidate, both in good and bad ways. I think it's easy to blame staff when things go wrong, but I think campaigns reflect the principle. And Obama had, when they sat down and talked about this campaign and decided to run, he said, look, here we got some rules of the road. One is this is going to be a collegial campaign. We are going to respect one another and we are going to get along. The no drama Obama dictum, as it came to be known. We are not going to leak. If we have disagreements, we're going to keep them in the family. We are going to be a grassroots campaign. We are going to be a bottom-up campaign. We're not going to be a top-down campaign. And we are going to enjoy it. We're going to have fun at this. James Carville said of the Clinton campaign later, it was the most joyless campaign he had ever seen, and the Obama campaign was not. A second thing I would say is that they had a strategic sense of what the campaign was to be about that did not change from start to finish. I talked to somebody recently who had worked in John Kerry's 2004 campaign, who said even as late as the general election, it was never clear exactly what the message of that campaign was to be or exactly why Kerry wanted to be president. And Obama said to us when we interviewed him in December of 08, right after the election, he said, if you look back at the speech I gave when I made my announcement, those themes carried through all the way to the very end. He said, we did not change the case we were making, we did not change the broad message. And I think that is a sign both of a good sense of strategic vision going in and a great sense of discipline carrying it through when in difficult times you're getting a lot of advice from a lot of people to make changes, and they had the confidence to do it. I think the third thing is that the Obama campaign operationally did things that no other campaign has ever done. I alluded to their understanding of the rules for how you win a Democratic nomination battle that was extremely effective. But in a lot of different ways, they broke the mold in how you do campaigns. They were groundbreakers in the integration of new media, new technology, and old-fashioned organizing. We have heard a lot about what they did with social networking and with email. They had 12 million email addresses, and they kept sending, I mean, if you were on their email list, you got a lot of emails from them. They not only developed a huge cadre of volunteers, but they did something that other campaigns have never done, and that is they made their volunteers responsible participants in the campaign. Usually the paid staff tells the volunteers what to do and the volunteers go do it. In this case, the Obama campaign identified, in a sense, the strongest, most able volunteers and turned them into unpaid staffers who were responsible for other volunteers and for other parts of the job. Their use of text messaging, their use of social networking, their ability to harness people from states where there was no competition, New York, for example, or California, to get them to work in other states, either as on-the-ground door knocking or phone banking. They did so many of those things extraordinarily well. They had metrics, the likes of which you wouldn't believe. They came to realize that it would take probably 7 visits, 7 contacts, real direct contacts with a voter to finally lock them in. Not 3, not 10, 7. And they figured out how many volunteers it would take in each state to reach the number of voters they needed for their vote goal 7 times. I mean, it was that level of detail that they went through. Their voter registration efforts were extraordinary in ways. Every campaign says we're going to go out and register new voters, and most of them make a half-hearted effort. The Obama campaign, with some help obviously from conditions. I don't want to say that the Obama campaign was singularly responsible for this, but they changed the shape of the electorate in Florida, in Pennsylvania, in Colorado, in Nevada, in a way that turned those states in their direction. John McCain's campaign was saying at the end they had an opportunity in Pennsylvania. John Carson, who ran a lot of the field operation for Obama, said he knew there was no chance that McCain could win in Pennsylvania simply because of the shift in voter registration that had gone on over the previous 9 months. So through all of those things, they were extraordinary.
I'm going to also remind all the students, if you dropped your name in the hat, out at the front desk as you came in tonight, we're giving out a number of Dan's books free, so you want to make sure as soon as the program concludes, if you signed up for that, that you go back and you see if you want a free book. This is your chance to get the author to sign it tonight. With that, we'll open it up to your questions. We have a question right here, Chelsea.
I appreciate your sharing your insights with us, sir.
Thank you.
My question to you is, were the factors of McCain's age and his record in the U.S. Senate any factors at all in his campaign?
I don't think they were decisive. I think that his age was certainly a factor, and I think that the Obama campaign always looked for ways subtly to remind people that John McCain would have been the oldest person ever elected president for the first time. But I don't think in the end that was decisive. For one reason, McCain is very vigorous, and was, a long campaign like that reveals strengths and weaknesses in candidates, in both intellectual capacity, but also physical capacity. And McCain showed no sign of his, weakness in being able to go dawn to, dark and beyond. And his mother's 96, and still more than active, so I don't think so. I think, I guess what I would say about his record in the Senate was that it was probably something that always made it more difficult for him to become the darling of the Republican base. I mean, that John McCain has always operated as a maverick. It's sort of his natural personality, and so he has always gotten into scrapes with people in his own party when he was on a different side of an issue. And so as a result of that, there were suspicions both among his Senate colleagues certainly, and also among parts of the different Republican constituencies about how reliable he was, how true a Republican he was, how conservative he was. He had a I think 100% pro-life voting record, and yet a lot of people in the abortion movement distrusted him. And so I think that was part of the reason that Palin was so helpful when he picked her, was in just kind of infusing the Republican base with an energy that McCain had not been able to do.
Margarita, do you have a question over here? What I'm going to do, Margarita and Chelsea, let you pick out people when you see people raise their hands. Just pick somebody out, but stay on your side. Okay, in this case, we'll make an exception, but come back over here next time.
All right. I just was, you had alluded to how the Obama campaign really broke the mold as far as the use of social media. Did you experience firsthand, like, how kind of Obama, like, orchestrated how he wanted his message to get out in those various networks?
Well, the interesting thing about that is that I don't think either Barack Obama or David Plouffe had any real sense of what it meant to tap into social networking. But they were smart enough to know that there were people who could do that for them. And if you looked at that operation, the people who were doing that were all very young, but had experience in that world. And they basically came in and built it. They built both the online fundraising operation, which raised, over the course of the campaign, $500 million. I mean, it is unbelievable what they raised online. And in small donations, but some of those small donors became big donors because they gave and gave and gave. And some of the people who were giving online ultimately probably gave, $1,000 or $1,500, or in a few cases, $2,300, which was the maximum you could get. So in some ways they were big donors, but they came in small bits. But I think that the Obama senior operation knew that there was energy at the grassroots, and that Obama had a unique ability, because they could feel it. As I said earlier, in 2006, as he is out campaigning for Senate and House candidates and on his book tour, they could see and feel the energy that was there at the grassroots for him. Well, the way to tap into that, and I guess the thing that he would have contributed most to that was, as a community organizer, he recognized the power of the grassroots. But I don't think Barack Obama understood how you tap into that with new media, but was smart enough to get the people who could do that. And they built an impressive system. I mean, I don't know if any of you ever went to or used mybarackobama.com. Howard Dean had used Meetup in 2003 to organize people and to get people to come out for him. That was a kind of an entirely primitive version of what the Obama team did. The Obama team obviously built the equivalent of Facebook or MySpace, but they built it in-house. They didn't try to graft themselves on and build a fan page on Facebook. They wanted it in-house because they could see it, not that they could necessarily control it. They weren't trying to control it, but they could see what was going on, and they could watch volunteers organizing themselves. I mean, Idaho's a great example. Little Caucus State, I think in 2004, there were like 5,000 people who participated in the caucuses. There was energy out there on a volunteer basis long before Obama went out there. And they finally sent a staff member out there in the fall of 2007. By this time, volunteers had already found office space. They had put in some phone lines. They were ready for the Obama team to come in and take it over. And when Obama went there a few days before Super Tuesday, there were 14,000 people who turned out in Boise to hear him. I mean, and that was a lot of it generated through the grassroots, organized through the Obama campaign. So they recognized the potential that was out there, and they found the people to do it.
Somebody over on this side, Chelsea.
Just piggybacking on the age thing, that's kind of interesting. My question was, being a KU student, I understand we have been kind of talking about the importance of our age group in the past election. And what do you think the importance of that is, other than maybe just the social media aspect? And to what degree do you think that were we truly that effective? I just wanted to know if you could talk about that.
I think the youth vote was very, very important in 2008, and I think that the youth vote, younger vote, going forward is one of the major problems that Republicans are going to have to figure out how to deal with. Obama was obviously uniquely suited to appeal to younger people, just in part because he was much younger than the other candidates. But also, I think he represented a different style. You know, as he talked about it, a style of politics that could perhaps move us past some of the old arguments and some of the old divisions. I think people who are under 30 have grown up in an America that is much different than the America that I grew up in. It is a much more diverse America. It is a more tolerant America. And Obama, literally through his own life story, seemed to embody that in a way. One of the interesting parts of the book to us when we were reporting it was the battle over Ted Kennedy's endorsement between the Clintons and Barack Obama. One of the things that Ted Kennedy saw in Obama was how much he was appealing to Kennedy's nieces and nephews and the younger generation of Kennedys. He had been out with Caroline Kennedy and her children in the summer of 2007, and those kids were just energized by Obama. And he had never seen young people as passionate about a political candidate in a generation, and in some ways in his own mind, not since his own brothers back in the 60s. Obama's ability to draw that to the Democratic Party was very important in the margins that he was able to roll up. And I think that for Republicans going forward, as this age cohort continues to move its way through the electorate, unless Republicans figure out how to attract those people back, there's going to be a long-term problem to the detriment of the Republican Party.
You've been painting a fascinating picture of Obama and his staff. Can you paint yourself into the picture and tell us more about how you gathered the information? Give us some specific examples of when you were in the room. Were you in the room, for instance, when Obama was practicing his speech and room service comes?
I wish.
Very good question, though.
It is a good question.
You weren't channeling Bob Woodward, were you?
No.
Okay.
No. I was not in the room for any private events. None of these campaigns was that open with us. But we talked to the campaigns at the beginning of the project. Haynes and I got together with this in early 2007 and agreed to do the book together. And Haynes was kind of Mr. Outside. Haynes is legendary as a journalist who has always been able to sort of capture the mood of America and describe America at historical points. And Haynes traveled apart from the candidates into the states before or after major primaries at the conventions. Haynes tapped into the voters. My responsibility was to try to get inside the campaigns. And so no campaign would let us come into the room for those episodes. And frankly, I didn't press hard on that. You can get too compromised, frankly, with too much access. And particularly, I had a special problem in a sense because I was reporting daily for the Washington Post and reporting for the book, and obviously wanted material for the book that hadn't already appeared in the Washington Post, but couldn't keep it out of the Post if it was really newsworthy. And so I didn't want to get in too many compromising positions. And I talked this through with our editors at the Post, and we worked out a satisfactory agreement on this. One of the things that we did was we had real-time interviews with senior staff of the campaigns embargoed for the book. And then we did a deep round of interviewing after the election was over. And so much of this inside material comes from people who were at these events who then told us the stories afterwards. So, we got the story from Denver from several of the 3 people who were in the room who shared it afterwards. We wanted to interview the candidates as often as we could. And I went to all of the campaigns at the beginning in the spring of '07 and explained the project. And everybody was open to it and enthusiastic about it, but nobody ever really bought into it for, I think, different reasons. We had 2 book-only interviews with Obama, one that took place in September of '07, which I did on the airplane, and one that took place 6 weeks after the election, which in many ways, it's the penultimate chapter in the book, and in many ways it's one of the most interesting interviews of the entire process, just because Obama was quite open that day and talked about his rivals and talked about the country and talked about race and talked about Abraham Lincoln, talked about the Reagan era and what it meant. And I mean, it was a lot of interesting stuff. Hillary Clinton never gave us an interview, much as we tried. And I thought we might get one after the election, but then she got selected to be Secretary of State, and there was no hope that she was going to talk about her rivalry with Barack Obama when she was going into the cabinet, so that ended that hope. McCain, we were able to do an interview with McCain about the primaries, but he also declined to do an interview after the election. I think this election was very hard on John McCain, and I think it has taken him some time to kind of process it through. And at the time, given our deadline, he was not ready to sit down and talk about it. I don't know if he is at this point, but he was not at that point. And so I was quite disappointed that we could not get either Senator Clinton or Senator McCain to sit down for the book, because I think that, and we tried to tell them this, that we were trying to do a sort of, a serious narrative history of the campaign and a fair-minded history. And we wanted, as much as possible, to have the candidates' voices as part of the historical record. And so we got as much of we could, but not all we wanted. The other aspect of the way we did this was that anything of any news value the Washington Post got first crack at, and the Post did 3 excerpts from the book. One built around the Obama interviews, a second built around the selection of Sarah Palin, where we had some fresh reporting, and the third was the Kennedy endorsement, where there is a lot of new material of the conversations between Bill Clinton and Ted Kennedy, phone conversations that were quite tense and difficult, and so the Post was able to get first crack at that before the book actually was out. So, but most of it was reconstructed.
We're going to take 2 more questions, one on each side. If there is one over here, seeing no. Well, there's a hand right there. And then one over here, Margarita, if you want to identify somebody.
You alluded to several things in the campaign about how they organized and so forth and so on. One of the questions I would be asked is, have you ever heard the term, in the campaign, they ever used the term geodemography and any of that kind of aspects of the campaign?
Yes, I think all campaigns now do this in some measure, and the Obama campaign did. I mean, the marrying of voting history, consumer data, demographic information, and mapping is central to all good modern big campaigns. It costs a lot of money. And sometimes you can be drowning in data and not know what it really means. And I think that sometimes campaigns get almost too enamored of it, that you can, if you think you can slice the electorate so thin, sometimes you slice your message too thin. And I think that the Obama campaign was effective at making the most of that kind of data, but keeping the message on a higher plane and talking to a broader cross-section than simply the targeted demographic groups. But yes, they did a lot of that. The amount of effort that they put into it, the study that went into it, they put together basically a kind of a data camp where they took a bunch of people, and I think it was Oregon. They went out to Oregon after the primaries and basically got people together to get them comfortable with the idea of how you crunch data in real time. Because obviously, you have to make use of this information quickly in order to make strategic decisions about, where you're putting your emphasis, where you're doing your mailings, where you're doing your door knocking, where you're sending your candidates, all of that. And they wanted to make sure that the people who were on the receiving end of this data would be able to do it. I've never heard of a campaign that went to the lengths that they did to do it. They looked at the different models for organizing that they had used in different states, because they organized Iowa in a different way than they organized South Carolina, and they figured out what was the sort of prototypical way to organize for the general election. So they did a huge amount of that, but they had a tremendous amount of data that they were crunching.
Last question.
It was my sense that in the analysis after the election that the Republicans did either a weak or a poor job of vetting Sarah Palin. Had they taken more time and had they done a more complete job of vetting her, do you think she still would have been the selection? And if not, how do you think that would have affected the race? Just what role did she play in the outcome?
My view of this is somewhat different than conventional wisdom. Excuse me. I think in the classic sense of vetting, they vetted her. In all of the reporting I did for this, I believe that they put her through the same vetting process that they put all of the other leading candidates. They knew there was nothing that came out about her in a kind of a scandalous way that they didn't know going in. They knew about the whole Troopergate issue, and they had some of the lawyers in the vetting team looking at that and talking to the lawyers up in Anchorage long before she was even on the shortest of short lists. She had to fill out the same 70-odd questionnaire that every other of the handful of finalists had to fill out, and these are very intrusive questions. It asks a lot of embarrassing questions. They had done a thorough, in their estimation, thorough public record search, which is standard. It's almost the first thing you do in vetting a candidate. So my reading of this is, in a legal sense, they gave her the same vetting that they gave everybody else. I think where they fell short is they did not give her a thorough political vetting. And by that I mean they knew she was a risk, but I don't think they adequately assessed how much of a risk that was to bring her onto the campaign. To take somebody as capable as she might be or might have been, but who is a first-term governor of a state with a small population and a state that is unlike almost every other state in the country, and expect that person to be able to perform on the national stage at the high level you have to perform from day one is asking a lot of anybody. And I think that they underappreciated that because they were, in a sense, so desperate to shake up the campaign. And so I think that the critique I would make of them is that they did not vet her in that sense. And I also, somebody said this to me when we were in St. Paul at the convention. This was a person who, didn't have a dog in the fight. But just said she was done a disservice by her own people. She did not have somebody around her who could have said to her, look, I can see why this is attractive, but this is not the right moment for you to do this. You should think twice about accepting this offer. But she obviously was ambitious and wanted to do it, and it's hard to say no when you're asked to do something like that. So I think that was a mistake. I don't think Sarah Palin cost John McCain the election. I don't think in the end vice presidential nominees decide presidential elections. They may make a difference for a moment or two, but in the end the race comes down to the two nominees for president. So if he had picked Tim Pawlenty, who was the runner-up, I think the election likely would have gone the same way. It would not have played out in the same way. They probably wouldn't have gotten as high a high as they got. They might not have gotten the sort of downward slope that she ended up on, which began with the Katie Couric interview and I think continued to go downhill after that. So I don't think it would have changed the election.
Yeah, I misspoke. I do have one more question I have to get to back here.
You touched on a lot of Sarah Palin over the course of the last hour, but I was wondering, what did the 2008 election do for her future? If you will, kind of speculate briefly what it put her on the national spotlight, but what will that do for her future and her future political career?
Well, you know, in some ways she was, I mean, there is no question that Sarah Palin captured the imagination of people all over this country. Some in a positive way and some in a negative way. But I have rarely seen, I don't know, I'd be happy to hear what Bill thinks. I have rarely seen a politician who is essentially unknown burst onto the national stage in the way she did and hold kind of, you know, the public's interest for a long time. You know, we can watch our website, and if you put Sarah Palin in a headline, it doesn't matter what the story is about, people go and read it. People are still fascinated by her. The campaign, I think, showed her strengths and her weaknesses. She has a natural political talent to connect with people. She is extraordinarily good on a rope line. She has, I think, an authenticity as a candidate. People look at her and think this is a real person. And particularly for the Republican, parts of the Republican base, there is a passion about her that she speaks as a real woman, a woman who has a family, small town, evokes a lot of those values. The weaknesses that she revealed are the same weaknesses that she's going to have to deal with as she goes forward. The question of, does she have the heft? Does she have the intellectual curiosity? Does she have the knowledge to take on a role as big and difficult as President of the United States? And I'm not sure at this point that she has used the period since the election until the time she resigned as governor to convince people that she had made that transition. I think there's still a lot of questions, and not just among Democrats who don't like her. I think among Republicans who had an open mind about her but are more skeptical about her now because of what they've observed since the election. She has not had a staff around her who has given her particularly good advice at some moments. She has another opportunity now. I mean, her book is about to come out. She will be on she'll start out on Oprah and go from there. She will be in the public eye, speaking for herself, not as governor, but as Sarah Palin. And I think she has an opportunity to have people look at her fresh. Somebody said to me, there's almost nobody in public life who holds their own future so much in their own hands as Sarah Palin, and I think that's a very astute observation.
Dan, thanks so much for coming out and joining us tonight.
Thank you, Bill.
Very good. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.